So glad you're back. I've got a crazy tale for you today.
Give me the keys to the lake house, Julian Vance snapped, his voice cutting through the polite clink of crystal at the center of the mahogany table. He didn't look at his sister as he spoke. Instead, he continued cutting his steak with the practiced, aggressive elegance of a man who believed the world owed him its finest cuts. Sloane Vance kept her fingers wrapped around her water goblet, feeling the bite of the cold condensation against her palm. She didn't flinch. She had spent a decade in the high-stakes world of forensic risk, learning to read the microscopic tells of liars and thieves, but Julian was a special case. He wasn't just a liar, he was a predator who believed his own press. "The lake house isn't mine to give, Julian," she said, her voice a calm, steady contrast to his jagged edges. "It's in a private trust." Julian finally looked up, his eyes narrowing. Beside him, Chloe Sterling, his new fiancée, shifted in her seat, the oversized diamond on her finger catching the light of the chandelier. Chloe was the daughter of a real estate mogul, a woman whose entire existence was curated for social media, and she looked at Sloane with a mixture of pity and boredom. "Don't be difficult, Sloane," Arthur Vance interjected from the head of the table. Her father didn't even look up from his wine. "Julian needs a place to host the Sterling family next weekend. It's about the family's image. You're just one person. You don't need 5 bedrooms in the mountains for your quiet weekends of auditing spreadsheets." "It's not about what I need, Father," Sloane replied. "It's about the legal structure of the—" "Legal structure," Julian laughed, a sharp barking sound that made Beatrice Vance, their mother, smile indulgently. "You've spent so much time looking at other people's money that you've forgotten how power actually works. I'm the one building an empire here. You're just the girl who checks the math. Chloe and I need that house. My investors expect a certain level of hospitality." Sloane felt a familiar heat rising in her chest, the rage spike she had learned to channel into cold, hard data. She looked around the table. Her parents were nodding, their faces illuminated by the soft glow of candles that cost more than most people's monthly groceries. They had always seen Julian as the golden boy, the entrepreneur, the visionary. They ignored the fact that every one of his ventures had collapsed, quietly bailaid out by family funds, or, as Sloane was beginning to suspect, something much darker. The scent of the overbearing lilies in the center of the table was becoming cloying, smelling more like a funeral than a celebratory dinner. "I saw the credit application for Vance Global Holdings today," Sloane said, her voice dropping an octave. Julian's fork paused midair. The arrogance didn't leave his face, but his pupils dilated, a classic stress response. "And I'm expanding. That's what CEOs do." "It's interesting," she continued, taking a slow sip of her water. "The application used a social security number that looked very familiar. In fact, it was off by only 1 digit from mine. Or rather, it was mine, with a deliberate clerical error in the middle." The table went silent. The only sound was the rhythmic, heavy ticking of the grandfather clock in the hallway. Chloe looked between them, her perfect brow furrowed in confusion. "Sloane, really," Beatrice sighed, waving a hand as if dismissing a fly. "Julian mentioned there might be some overlap in the family accounts. It's all for the same goal. We are a unit." "A unit?" Sloane asked. "Is that what we're calling identity theft now?" Julian slammed his hand onto the table, making the silverware jump. "Watch your mouth. I am the future of this family's legacy. You're a glorified bookkeeper. You should be honored that your credit score is finally being used for something other than buying sensible shoes and cat food." He leaned forward, his voice dropping to a hiss. "You're going to hand over those keys, and you're going to stop poking around in my filings. If you don't, I'll have Father remove your access to the Vance Trust entirely. You'll be sitting in that gray cubicle of yours with nothing but your integrity to keep you warm." Sloane felt the phone in her blazer pocket vibrate, a high-priority alert. She didn't need to look at it to know what it was. Her team at the firm had been running a deep-dive audit on a series of forged signatures related to a massive property embezzlement scheme. She looked at Julian, seeing the sweat beginning to bead at his hairline despite his bravado. He thought he was the lion in this room. He thought she was the prey because she lived quietly, because she didn't flaunt wealth she hadn't earned, and because she worked for a living. "You're right, Julian," Sloane said, standing up slowly. She smoothed her blazer, her fingers brushing the hidden pocket where she kept her digital recorder. "Power is about who holds the keys, but you're mistaken about which house we're talking about." She looked at Chloe, who was watching the exchange with growing unease. "Chloe, he's a charming man, but I'd check your own accounts before the wedding. Julian has a habit of borrowing things he can never return." "Sit down, Sloane," Arthur shouted, his face reddening. "I'm done with dinner," Sloane said, her voice ice cold. She turned and walked toward the foyer, the sound of her heels echoing on the marble like a countdown. As she reached the heavy oak front door, she pulled out her phone. The alert was confirmed. The primary signature on the forged $10 million loan wasn't just a copy of hers. It was a direct digital lift from a document Julian had stolen from her desk 3 months ago. She stepped out into the cool night air, the heavy scent of the lilies finally replaced by the smell of rain on pavement. She pulled up a contact in her phone labeled Leo Vance. "It's me," she said when he picked up. "The lion is awake. Start the forensic freeze on every account associated with Vance Global. And Leo, don't leave him a single cent for a lawyer." She looked back at the glowing windows of the mansion. Inside, they were still laughing, still entitled, still unaware that the walls were already beginning to crumble. Julian wanted the keys to the lake house, but by the time Sloane was finished, he wouldn't even have a key to a locker. The next morning, the clinical silence of Sloane's private office felt like a sanctuary compared to the suffocating opulence of the mansion. She sat behind her glass desk, the hum of the server room a low, steady thrum against her nerves. Leo Vance stood by the window, his tablet glowing with a cascade of red flags. The smell of bitter espresso hung in the air, sharp and grounding, a stark contrast to the cloying lilies of the night before. "He didn't just stop at the loan, Sloane," Leo said, his voice tight with a mixture of professional disgust and familial anger. He turned the screen toward her. "Julian used your primary brokerage account as a secondary guarantee for the Sterling merger. He's leveraged your entire personal portfolio to back his play with Chloe's family. If that deal fails, or if the bank calls the loan, they come for your assets first." Sloane didn't flinch. She felt the cold, polished edge of her fountain pen against her thumb. The audacity was almost breathtaking. Julian wasn't just stealing her signature, he was trying to hollow out her entire life to build a throne for himself. "He thinks he's playing with a safety net," she said, her voice a calm, dangerous silk. "He doesn't realize he's already cut the ropes." The heavy glass doors of the suite swung open without a knock. Arthur and Beatrice Vance marched in, looking as though they owned the floor. Beatrice was draped in midnight silk, her perfume, something floral and aggressively expensive, clashing with the sterile office air. She didn't look at the workstation or the awards on the wall. She looked at her daughter with the weary disappointment one might reserve for a stain on a rug. "Sloane, really," Beatrice sighed, adjusting a heavy gold cuff on her wrist. The metal clinked, a sound of casual wealth that had always grated on Sloane's ears. "Julian is in a state. He says you're threatening to freeze the corporate accounts associated with the Lake House project. Do you have any idea how embarrassing that is for him? He's trying to impress Chloe's father." "It's more than embarrassing, Beatrice," Arthur added, his voice booming with the unearned authority he'd spent decades cultivating. He stood in the center of the room, legs braced as if he were on the deck of a yacht. "It's a betrayal of the family name. We gave Julian those old files from the attic because he needed your historical signatures for the foundation paperwork. It's all for the common good, Sloane. Stop being so difficult." Sloane felt the phantom sting of a slap. They hadn't just stood by, they had handed Julian the tools for the theft. Her own parents had raided her past to fund her brother's fraudulent future. "The common good," Sloane repeated, the words tasting like copper. "And I suppose the common good will be on full display at the gala." "Saturday night," Beatrice said, finally meeting her daughter's eyes with a look of pity. "The Vance Foundation Gala. Chloe's father is announcing the merger and the gift to the Lake House project. We expect you to be there, smiling, and for heaven's sake, wear something that doesn't look like it came from a library. We have a reputation to maintain, even if you don't care about yours." Arthur nodded, already turning toward the door. "Fix the accounts, Sloane. Don't make me tell you again. Julian is the future of the firm, you're just the record keeper." After they swept out, leaving the scent of arrogance and expensive jasmine in their wake, the office felt colder. Sloane turned her chair back to the monitors. Her parents didn't know that the record keeper was the one who held the keys to the vault. They didn't know that this firm, the one they treated like her little hobby, was the silent majority stakeholder in the very bank Julian was currently defrauding. "You have the forensic trail for the attic files?" Sloane asked. "Every digital footprint," Leo confirmed, stepping away from the window. "I've secured the original ledger Aunt Martha found. It's airtight. We have the proof of intent, the forgery, and now, thanks to your parents, we have the accomplices." Sloane looked at the digital invitation on her screen, a gold-embossed card for the gala. 3 days. Good. Let Julian have his moment in the spotlight. Let him stand on that stage and tell the world how he built his empire. She felt a predatory calm settle over her, a stillness that preceded the storm. The higher he climbs, the more bones he'll break when he hits the ground. Leo, make sure the forensic freeze is timed for the exact moment the merger is signed on Saturday. I want him to feel the pen go dry in his hand. 2 days later, the morning sun cut through the floor-to-ceiling windows of Leo's private office, illuminating the dust motes dancing over a heavy, leather-bound ledger. The air smelled of aged paper and the sharp, sterile scent of high-end espresso. Sloane Vance sat across from her cousin, her fingers tracing the embossed gold lettering on the cover. This wasn't just a book. It was a casket for Julian's reputation. Leo tapped a rhythm on his tablet, his eyes reflecting lines of green code. "The digital forensic trail is a masterpiece of stupidity, Sloane. He didn't even use a VPN when he accessed the Sterling Trust accounts from the home Wi-Fi. It's all here, the IP logs, the timestamp transfers, and the digital signature he thought he'd scrubbed." Sloane opened the ledger to the middle section. There, in Aunt Martha's meticulous handwriting, were the original records of the Vance family holdings before Julian began his restructuring. Tucked between the pages was the physical smoking gun, a power of attorney document where Sloane's signature had been traced with such clumsy precision that the ink had bled through the parchment. "He was so sure I'd never look," she whispered, the texture of the forged paper rough beneath her thumb. "He thought I was too busy being the disappointment to notice he was cannibalizing my inheritance." "He's blinded by the glow of his own ego," Leo said, leaning back. The leather of his chair creaked in the quiet room. "I've synchronized the freeze. The moment the merger documents are digitally signed at the gala tomorrow night, the Sterling Bank will trigger a fraud alert. Every account he's touched will lock. He'll be standing on that stage, trying to toast his brilliance, while his credit cards turn into useless plastic in his pocket." Sloane felt a cold, predatory satisfaction settle in her chest. "And the forensic report, delivered to the Sterling family's lead counsel an hour ago," Leo confirmed with a sharp grin. "Anonymous, of course. They'll have just enough time to verify the data before the first course is served." The scene shifted an hour later to the Vance family estate. The house was a hive of frantic, shallow energy. The hiss of a steam iron and the cloying scent of Julian's expensive, musky cologne filled the hallway. Sloane stood in the doorway of the dressing room, watching as a tailor pinned the lapels of a custom midnight blue tuxedo. Julian Vance caught her reflection in the three-way mirror and smirked, not bothering to turn around. "Still wearing the same off-the-rack blazer, Sloane. You really should try to put in an effort for tomorrow. It's a gala, not a PTA meeting." Arthur and Beatrice Vance were seated on a nearby velvet settee, sipping champagne while they watched their son's transformation. Arthur didn't even look up from his financial journal. "Your brother is right, Sloane. This merger is the crowning achievement of the Vance legacy. The least you can do is not look like a charity case in the background of the photos." "I'll try to stay out of the light, Father," Sloane said, her voice a calm, flat line. Julian laughed, a sharp, entitled sound that grated against the silence of the room. He stepped off the pedestal, waving the tailor away with a dismissive flick of his hand. He walked towards Sloane, the heavy scent of his arrogance preceding him. "Actually, I've been thinking, maybe you shouldn't be in the main ballroom at all. Chloe's parents are bringing some very influential investors. I don't want you cornering them with your little accounting stories. Why don't you stay in the kitchen and help Martha manage the caterers? It's more your speed." Beatrice chuckled, adjusting her pearl necklace. "It would be a help, dear. You've always had a knack for the mundane." Sloane felt the weight of the digital drive in her pocket, the key that would dismantle everything they saw when they looked at Julian. She didn't flinch as he leaned closer, his eyes bright with a cruel, flickering triumph. "Do you understand, Sloane?" Julian whispered, loud enough for their parents to hear. "In this family, there are architects and there are laborers. I've built an empire while you've been busy filing papers. Tomorrow night, the world finally sees who the real Vance heir is." Sloane met his gaze, her expression unreadable. She could see the tiny pulse in his neck, the frantic heartbeat of a man who didn't realize he was standing on a trapdoor. "I understand perfectly, Julian. I think tomorrow night will be a revelation for everyone, more than you can possibly imagine." Julian patted her shoulder with condescending affection. "That's the spirit. Know your place, and we might even let you keep your job at the firm after I take over the board." He turned back to the mirror, admiring the silhouette of a man who owned the world. He didn't see Sloane's hand tighten around the drive. He didn't see the way Chloe Sterling lingered in the hallway, her face pale as she clutched a manila envelope Leo had accidentally left on the hall table. Sloane walked away, the sound of her heels steady on the marble floor. She had the ledger. She had the logs. She had the witness. The countdown had reached the final 24 hours. Tomorrow, the architect would watch his empire turn to dust, and Sloane would be the one holding the match. The day before the Vance Foundation gala, the family estate hummed with the predatory efficiency of a shark tank. Sloane Vance stood in the center of the grand foyer, her heels silent on the Persian rug, as she watched a small army of caterers and florists transform the house into a monument to her brother's ego. The air was thick with the cloying, sweet scent of 3,000 white lilies, Julian's favorite, chosen specifically because they signaled purity and legacy. Julian Vance descended the mahogany staircase, adjusting his gold cufflinks with the practiced ease of a man who believed the world existed solely for his convenience. He stopped 3 steps from the bottom, looking down at Sloane with a smirk that didn't reach his eyes. "Still here, Sloane? I thought you'd be tucked away in your little office, playing with your spreadsheets. This event is for the heavy hitters, people who actually contribute to the Vance name." Sloane didn't flinch. She adjusted the strap of her handbag, feeling the hard, rectangular weight of the encrypted drive against her side. "I wouldn't miss it for the world, Julian. In fact, I've been reviewing the Foundation's 2021 acquisition logs. You might want to take one last look at the subledgers tonight. There are some inconsistencies that might be difficult to explain if anyone asks the wrong questions tomorrow." He let out a sharp, condescending laugh that echoed off the high ceilings. "Inconsistencies? My auditors are the best money can buy. You're just looking for ghosts because you can't stand that I'm the one holding the gavel now. Stick to your risk assessments and stay out of the grown-up business." He stepped past her, the smell of his expensive, wood-smoke cologne trailing in his wake like a threat. From the shadow of the dining room, Beatrice Vance emerged, her face a mask of disappointment. She didn't look at the floral arrangements, she looked directly at Sloane. "Must you always be so difficult, dear? Your brother is about to be named chairman emeritus. This is a time for family unity, not for your petty professional jealousies." "It's not jealousy, Mother," Sloane said, her voice dropping to a level of calm that made Beatrice pause. "It's a warning. Julian is building his house on sand. When it collapses, I'd hate for you and Father to be caught in the debris." Arthur Vance appeared behind his wife, his hand resting heavily on her shoulder. He didn't offer Sloane a greeting. "Enough, Sloane. If you're going to be a guest in this house, learn to act like one. Go help Chloe Sterling with her jewelry. She's in the library, and she's far more important to this family's future than your audit reports." Sloane watched them walk away, their footsteps heavy and rhythmic on the marble floor. She found Chloe in the library, surrounded by velvet-lined boxes. The younger woman looked up, her face pale and her eyes red-rimmed. She was clutching a manila envelope, her knuckles white. When she saw Sloane, she quickly shoved the papers back into the folder, but not before Sloane saw the distinctive blue stamp of a forensic accountant's seal. "He's lying to me, isn't he?" Chloe whispered, her voice trembling as she touched a diamond necklace that likely cost more than a suburban home. The stones felt cold against her skin, a glittering cage of Julian's making. Sloane moved closer, the silence of the library pressing in around them. "Julian only tells the truths that serve him, Chloe, but the numbers don't have an agenda." "I saw the signature on the escrow release," Chloe said, her voice barely audible. "It doesn't match the one on our marriage license. It looks like yours." Sloane reached out, her hand hovering just inches from Chloe's arm. "Tomorrow night, the truth won't be a whisper anymore. It's going to be a roar. You just have to decide which side of the glass you want to be on when it shatters." A phone buzzed in Sloane's pocket. She stepped away and glanced at the screen. It was a message from Leo Vance. "Server bypass complete. The projector is synced. Sleep well, cousin. Tomorrow we burn it down." Sloane looked back at the grand foyer where Julian was now shouting orders at a terrified waiter. He looked powerful. He looked untouchable. She felt a surge of cold, sharp adrenaline. She had given him his warning. He had laughed in her face. Now there were only 18 hours left until the architect of the Vance empire watched his first and last gala turn into a crime scene. She turned and walked toward the exit, her mind already visualizing the look on Julian's face when the lights went down and the real show began. The evening of the Vance legacy, gala arrived with a heavy, expectant stillness that seemed to press against the tall, arched windows of the family estate. By 7 o'clock, the driveway was a river of gleaming black town cars and silver European sedans, each disgorging the city's elite into a foyer that smelled of forced lilies and expensive, cloying perfumes. Sloane Vance stood at the edge of the mezzanine, her fingers grazing the cool marble of the balustrade as she watched the spectacle below. She wore a dress of midnight silk, simple and sharp, a stark contrast to the sea of sequins and over-the-top lace swirling beneath the crystal chandeliers. Down in the center of the ballroom, Julian Vance was already holding court. He looked every bit the heir apparent in a bespoke tuxedo that probably cost more than a teacher's annual salary. He was laughing, a loud, performative sound that carried over the polite hum of the string quartet, his hand resting possessively on the small of Chloe Sterling's back. Chloe looked radiant in ivory, though her smile didn't quite reach her eyes. She looked like a woman who was starting to realize the golden pedestal she stood on was made of painted lead. Sloane felt a familiar, cold prickle of irritation as she watched him. Julian was currently regaling a group of venture capitalists with the story of his latest breakthrough in forensic risk modeling, the very system Sloane had spent 3 years perfecting in the quiet hours of the night, only for him to strip her name from the patent and claim the genius as his own. "He looks like he's already won," a voice murmured beside her. She didn't turn to see Leo Vance. He was leaning against a pillar, looking bored in his suit, but his eyes were sharp, scanning the room with the precision of a predator. "Let him enjoy the view from the top," she replied, her voice low and steady. "The air is always thinnest right before the fall. Is everything ready?" He gave a single, microscopic nod. "The server bypass is holding. I've synced the main projector to the secondary drive. When the presentation starts, he won't be showing the growth charts for the new firm. He'll be showing the world exactly where that seed money came from. And the physical copies. Aunt Martha has them. She's sitting at the head table with your parents. She's waiting for your signal." Sloane glanced toward the front of the room. Arthur and Beatrice Vance were seated with the air of royalty, nodding graciously to guests who approached them. They looked so proud of their son, the visionary who had saved the family reputation. They didn't see their daughter as anything more than a necessary shadow, a quiet worker bee whose only job was to ensure Julian's light never flickered. The betrayal still tasted like copper in her mouth, a sharp reminder of the night she had found her mother at her desk, photographing her private ledgers to hand them over to her brother. She began her descent down the grand staircase. As she reached the bottom, Julian spotted her. He didn't offer a greeting, he offered a target. He excused himself from the investors and sauntered over, his face twisting into that familiar, condescending smirk that made her skin crawl. "Sloane," he said, his voice dripping with mock affection. "I'm surprised you showed up. I figured you'd be at home, buried under a pile of spreadsheets. You look adequate. Though perhaps a bit underdressed for an event of this caliber, this isn't one of your little cubicle meetings." "It's a family event, Julian," she said calmly, meeting his gaze without blinking. "I wouldn't miss it for the world, especially not tonight." He leaned in closer, the smell of expensive bourbon and arrogance radiating off him. "Don't get any ideas about making a scene. I know you're bitter about the promotion, but tonight is about the future of the Vance name. My name. Try to remember your place for once. You're the help, Sloane. Valuable help, sure, but you don't belong on the stage." He reached out, flicking a stray thread from her shoulder with a sneer. "Now, go find Martha. She's been asking for more champagne. Try to be useful." He turned his back on her before she could respond, heading toward the stage where a large digital screen displayed a shimmering logo. Vance Global, the future of security. Sloane didn't move. She watched him climb the 3 steps to the podium, the spotlight catching the gold watch on his wrist, another gift he'd bought himself with the dividends from her stolen accounts. The room began to quiet as the master of ceremonies tapped the microphone, signaling for the guests to take their seats. She felt a hand on her arm. It was Chloe. The younger woman's face was pale, her grip on Sloane's sleeve almost desperate. "Sloane, I saw the files you left in my dressing room. Is it true?" "About the signatures? About the Sterling Trust?" Sloane looked at her, seeing the genuine fear in the girl's eyes. "The truth is about to be the only thing left standing in this room, Chloe. You just have to decide if you're going to stay on that stage when the floor disappears." Chloe's hand dropped. She looked toward the podium, where Julian was now tapping the microphone, beaming at the crowd of 500 people. He looked untouchable. He looked like a god. Sloane moved toward the back of the room, threading through the tables of silent, expectant witnesses. She saw Aunt Martha reach into her silk clutch, her hand closing around a thick envelope. She saw Leo positioned by the tech booth, his thumb hovering over the enter key on his laptop. Julian cleared his throat, his voice booming through the speakers. "Ladies and gentlemen, distinguished guests, and most importantly, my family. Tonight, we celebrate more than just a company. We celebrate a legacy of integrity, innovation, and the Vance name." Sloane reached the shadows of the rear exit and turned back. She caught Leo's eye and gave a sharp, final nod. "But before we look at the numbers," Julian continued, his chest puffed out with unearned pride, "I want to show you the foundation of our success. I want to show you exactly how we built this empire." He gestured grandly to the screen behind him. The lights in the ballroom dimmed to a dramatic low. The crowd went silent, leaning forward in their seats. "Leo," Sloane whispered into the dark. "Drop the curtain." The screen flickered, but instead of the sleek corporate video Julian expected, a grainy, high-resolution scan of a legal document snapped into view. It was a signature page, dated 3 years ago. At the bottom, Julian's handwriting was unmistakable, scrawled clumsily over a forged version of Sloane's own name. Julian's smile didn't just fade. It froze, a mask of confused horror beginning to crack as the first murmur of recognition rippled through the front row. Sloane stood in the darkness, her heart beating with a cold, rhythmic precision. The countdown was over. The roar was coming. The silence in the ballroom was heavy, a physical weight that pressed the air out of the room. The only sound was the low, electric hum of the projector, casting the giant image of Julian's forged signature across his own terrified face. He looked like a ghost haunting his own celebration. Julian Vance didn't move. The color didn't just leave his face. It seemed to be sucked out by the very light of the projector, leaving his skin the shade of wet ash. His jaw unhinged slightly, his lower lip trembling with a rhythmic, pathetic twitch that he couldn't suppress. The confident, predatory smirk he'd worn like armor for a decade shattered into 1,000 jagged pieces, leaving behind the hollow, wide-eyed stare of a man watching his own execution in high definition. His pupils dilated until his eyes were nothing but twin pits of ink, darting frantically from the screen to the silent crowd, searching for a lie big enough to save him. No words came, only a faint, wet clicking sound in the back of his throat. "That's not," Julian finally managed, his voice a thin, reedy ghost of its former self. "That's a mistake, a technical glitch." "It's a forensic scan, Julian," Sloane said, her voice cutting through the stagnant air like a scalpel. She stepped out from the shadows of the wings, the heels of her shoes clicking against the polished wood of the stage with the precision of a ticking clock. She didn't look angry. She looked bored, which was infinitely more terrifying. Chloe Sterling gasped, her hand flying to her throat. She looked from the screen to the man she was supposed to marry, her eyes filling with a sudden, sharp clarity. She stepped back, her silk gown rustling in the silence, creating a visible gap between her and the man who had built a life on a foundation of stolen ink. In the front row, Arthur Vance looked as though he had aged 20 years in 20 seconds. He stared at the floor, unable to meet the giant, glowing evidence of the sun he had enabled. Beside him, Beatrice gripped her pearl necklace so hard the string looked ready to snap, her eyes fixed on the unmistakable scrawl of her son's betrayal. "Julian!" a voice boomed from the darkness of the tables. It was Leo Vance, standing tall with a tablet in his hand. "The authorities have the original documents. The ink analysis matches your pen, dated the day Sloane was in the hospital. You didn't just steal her ideas, you stole her life." A murmur erupted, a low tide of disgust that swept through the rows of black ties and evening gowns. One of the primary investors, a woman who had just handed Julian a ceremonial check, snatched it back from the podium with a sneer of pure loathing. Sloane reached the center of the stage. She didn't look at the crowd. She looked directly at Julian, who was sweating now, the beads of moisture glistening under the stage lights like grease. The smell of the expensive lilies decorating the stage suddenly felt cloying, like a funeral. "You spent years telling me I didn't belong in these rooms," Sloane said softly, the microphone carrying her whisper to every corner of the hall. "You told me I was just a ghost in the machine of your empire. But you forgot one thing about ghosts, Julian." She leaned in, her eyes cold enough to freeze the champagne in the guests' glasses. "They own the house they haunt." She reached out and plucked the CEO nameplate from the podium, the plastic clicking against her fingernails. "Security is waiting in the lobby to escort you out. Don't worry about your things. I've already had them moved to a much smaller space, a locker at the bus station, to be precise." Sloane turned her back on him before he could find his breath to beg. She walked off the stage, her head held high, the sound of her own steady heartbeat drowning out the sudden, frantic shouting of the man who had finally run out of shadows to hide in. She didn't look back. The roar she had promised had finally arrived, and she didn't need to see the wreckage to know the empire was gone. The silence that followed her walk off the stage was heavier than the applause that had preceded it. It was a vacuum, a sudden drop in pressure that made the ears of every socialite and board member in the room pop. Sloane didn't stop until she reached the edge of the velvet curtain, her heels clicking a steady, rhythmic death march against the hardwood. Behind her, the air finally rushed back in, carrying with it the frantic, high-pitched desperation of a man who had finally realized the floor had vanished beneath him. "This is a fabrication," Julian Vance screamed, his voice cracking as it echoed through the high rafters of the hall. He turned to the crowd, his hands chest-high and palms out, a politician's gesture that looked absurdly like a plea for mercy. "She's unstable. My sister has been obsessed with my success since we were children. These documents are digital forgeries. Leo, tell them. You're the accountant, tell them how easy it is to fake a ledger." Leo Vance stepped out from the shadows of the tech booth, his face illuminated by the cold, blue light of the tablet in his hands. He didn't look like an ally anymore. He looked like an executioner. He didn't say a word. He simply swiped his finger across the screen, and the giant projector behind Julian shifted. It was no longer showing bank statements. It was a high-resolution video of Julian sitting in a darkened office, his face clear as day, laughing as he practiced Sloane's signature onto a series of offshore transfer authorizations. The audio was crisp, cutting through the room like a blade. "She'll never notice," the recorded version of Julian said, his tone dripping with the same arrogance he'd used to dismiss Sloane for years. "She's too busy being a corporate drone to realize I'm the one driving the car." Julian's face didn't just pale, it seemed to dissolve. The arrogant smirk he'd worn like armor for years curdled into a sickly, gray mask of disbelief. His eyes, usually sharp with calculated malice, darted frantically toward the exits, the pupils blown wide with animal panic. A fine sheen of sweat broke across his forehead, matting his expensive hair, while his jaw hung slack, trembling with a silent, pathetic protest that refused to form into words. The muscles in his neck corded as he struggled to swallow, his entire composure shattering like glass under a hammer. He looked smaller, suddenly, as if the weight of the lies had physically crushed his spine. Martha Vance stepped forward then, emerging from the front row. She wasn't carrying a drink or a designer clutch. She held a weathered, leather-bound folder, the original Vance estate registry. She walked to the edge of the stage, her gaze fixed on Julian with a mixture of pity and ironclad resolve. "I watched you do it, Julian," she said, her voice carrying without the need for a microphone. "I watched you take the papers from your father's desk. I kept the originals. I waited for Sloane to be ready." The shift in the room was visceral. Chloe Sterling, who had been standing frozen in her Vera Wang gown, suddenly looked at Julian as if he were a specimen under a microscope. She didn't scream. She didn't cry. She simply reached up, unclasped the 5-carat diamond necklace Julian had gifted her, bought with Sloane's diverted dividends, and let it fall. It hit the stage with a sharp, metallic clink that sounded like a gavel. She turned her back on him, walking toward the exit without a single word, her bridesmaids trailing behind her like a retreating army. Then came the enablers. Arthur and Beatrice Vance moved toward the stage, but they weren't looking at their son. Their eyes were fixed on Sloane, who stood at the periphery, watching the wreckage. "Sloane, darling," Beatrice started, her voice trembling with a terrifyingly fake sweetness. "We had no idea. We were just trying to keep the family together. You know how Julian can be. We'll fix this. We'll go home and sort this out as a family." Arthur nodded, reaching out a hand as if to pat Sloane's shoulder. "You've proven your point, Lee. You're the smart one. We see that now. Let's get the lawyers to quiet this down before the press catches wind." Sloane stepped back, avoiding the touch as if it were toxic. The smell of Beatrice's expensive, floral perfume, the scent of her childhood neglect made her stomach turn. "There is no we, Arthur, and there is no home to go to. I bought the estate through a holding company 6 months ago. The locks were changed an hour ago. Your things are being delivered to a motel on the outskirts of the city." The sound of heavy boots thudded against the floor. 4 men in dark suits, the unmistakable silhouette of private security, moved onto the stage. They didn't ask Julian to leave. They flanked him, their presence a silent command. Julian looked at his parents, then at the silent, judging faces of the board members he had tried to swindle. He reached out to grab the podium, his knuckles white, but his hands were shaking too hard to hold on. "You can't do this. I am a Vance." Sloane looked at him one last time. The rage that had fueled her for 5 years hadn't vanished, but it had cooled into something much more powerful, indifference. "You were a Vance," she said, her voice a calm, chilling whisper that somehow reached him across the distance. "But you forgot the most important rule of the family business. Never try to con the person who keeps the books." She didn't wait for the security team to drag him out. She didn't wait to see her parents realize they were homeless. She turned and walked through the double doors, the cool night air hitting her face like a benediction. Behind her, the shouting started, the sound of an empire finally collapsing into the dirt, but she didn't look back. She had a new ledger to open, and for the first time in her life, the only name on the cover was her own. 6 months later, The view from the 42nd floor of the Sterling Vance building offered a clarity that the old family estate never could. Sloane Vance stood by the floor-to-ceiling glass, watching the morning fog lift off the harbor. The scent of expensive espresso and fresh lilies filled her new office, a sharp, professional contrast to the suffocating smell of mothballs and old money that had defined her childhood. She adjusted the cuff of her charcoal blazer, feeling the weight of the silver watch Martha Vance had given her to celebrate the firm's first successful quarter. A soft chime announced a visitor. Leo Vance walked in, his gait lighter than it had been in years. He wasn't carrying a stack of forged ledgers this time. Instead, he held a single, slim tablet. He leaned against the mahogany desk, scrolling through a news feed that had been the talk of the financial district all morning. "The sentencing came down an hour ago," Leo said, his voice devoid of the usual tension. 5 years for the identity theft, another 3 for the wire fraud. The judge didn't take kindly to his affluenza defense. Sloane didn't turn around immediately. She let the words settle. Julian Vance, the man who had once stood atop a podium and claimed her life as his own, was now a number in a state database. She thought of the grainy photo she'd seen in the morning's digital edition. Julian standing outside the courthouse in a suit that was 2 sizes too large, his face sallow and his signature arrogance replaced by a hollow, frantic look of a man who finally realized no one was coming to save him. "And Arthur and Beatrice?" Sloane asked, her voice steady. "They've officially moved into the 2-bedroom apartment in the suburbs," Leo replied, tapping the tablet. "The estate sale finished yesterday. Every piece of Vance history, the portraits, the silver, the heirlooms they used to bribe Julian's silence, it's all gone to pay back the creditors. Your father tried to call the office again this morning. He wanted to know if you'd consider an allowance for your mother's medical expenses." Sloane finally turned, her gaze cool. She remembered the night they had helped Julian steal her private documents, the way Beatrice had looked her in the eye and lied about where the keys were kept. "Block the number, Leo. They made their investment in Julian. They can live with the returns." It was the cost of justice, a bitter pill that Sloane swallowed every morning. She had won. She had her name back, her wealth was secured in a firm that actually valued ethics, and she had dismantled a dynasty of lies. But the silence at her Thanksgiving table would be absolute. She had traded a family of snakes for a life of solitude, and while the peace was a benediction, the scars on her heart remained. Later that afternoon, Chloe Sterling joined her for lunch in the building's private garden. The 2 women sat in the sun, the sound of a nearby fountain providing a rhythmic backdrop to their conversation. Chloe looked radiant, the shadow of her disastrous near marriage to Julian having vanished. She was now the primary stakeholder in her family's conglomerate, and her partnership with Sloane's forensic firm had already uncovered 3 other cases of corporate embezzlement in the city. "I saw him, you know," Chloe said, swirling the ice in her water. "I had to go to the courthouse to sign the final annulment papers. Julian tried to stop me in the hallway. He actually had the audacity to ask if I'd wait for him. He told me he still loved me." Sloane felt a flicker of the old rage, a familiar heat in her chest. "What did you say?" Chloe smiled, a sharp, triumphant expression. "I didn't say anything. I just looked at his shoes. They were scuffed and cheap." I think that hurt him more than any words could. He realized he was invisible to me. As the sun began to set, Sloane returned to her desk. She picked up a heavy, leather-bound ledger, the first one she had started for her own company. It wasn't a book of secrets or a weapon used for revenge. It was a record of growth, of legitimate success, and of a future built on a foundation that wouldn't crumble under the weight of a single lie. She opened the cover. The first page was blank, waiting for the next chapter of a life she had finally earned. Outside, the city lights began to twinkle like fallen stars. Sloane Vance took a deep breath, the cool evening air filling her lungs, and began to write. The empire was gone, but for the first time, the woman standing in the ruins was truly free.
I hope you enjoyed this wild story. Don't forget to subscribe for more. See you in the next one.